Two men suspected of preying on people in a crime spree are...
Gonzalez was arrested in Orlando on Thursday, one day after the body was found inside that home, which is near 20.
Corner of Wyoming and Chicago, near where two of the victims were targeted.
Denver police say 100 gunshots were exchanged in a deadly battle between suspected gang members early Saturday in a parking lot near 19th and
at a light rail station may now become a topic of national conversation as we learn that one of the suspects was wanted for deportation.
Hello, welcome to the Dr. Junkie Show. I'm your host, Ben Boyce, and today's episode is about the media, that great doorway into spaces and places we might not otherwise have access to. Spaces like prison, or war, or faraway countries, or even make-believe worlds. The things we see on television and in movies, from fictional comedies to primetime news, they teach us things about the world in which we live. And it turns out that the news isn't actually as purely informative as we might think. When producers decide which stories to cover, they have to consider a lot. How easy is this story to understand? How fast can we tell it? Will anyone sue us if we accuse them of a crime? Is the story scandalous or salacious? Will it get people to stay tuned in? The media is just a camouflaged group of capitalist producers competing to sell us the cheapest version of the product we want. If we wanted to see nothing but stories about cats stuck in trees, that's what they would give us. And they would make sure we could understand the stories by appealing to things we already know about the world, like the role of the fire department, or the image of a road sign to inform viewers where an event took place, or a clip of an owner gazing up into a tree, things that get the message across clearly and effectively. You know how sometimes TV feels kind of, racist-y? Like it sometimes feels like they show us way more black folks in criminal roles and way more white guys in hero roles, like cops or even literal superheroes. Well, it turns out that when you take the time to analyze the media, you find that they do indeed show us misrepresentations of reality. You find that black and brown folks tend to be depicted as criminals and white folks tend to be depicted as cops. That's just one of the projects my guest today has been involved in. He collects data about how often local and national news shows depict black men as criminals and white men as victims or as police officers. And the results are revealing. As you probably expect, he's repeatedly found that black folks are much more likely to be depicted as criminals than as cops, and that white folks are much more likely to be depicted as cops than as criminals, even when comparing local coverage with actual local percentages of cops and criminals. But he also discovered some revealing updates in the recipe for successful news programs, things that have changed recently. And if you've been listening to this podcast for any amount of time, it won't surprise you to learn that when the United States updates a problem, we usually do so in a way that doesn't actually fix anything, so much as shift the worst of the oppression around a little bit. Dr. Dixon is a professor and the director of graduate studies at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He's authored numerous articles and overseen studies related not just to news coverage, but to rap, social media, and the way in which all of these media affect those of us who consume them in underhanded and hard-to-spot ways. We're going to discuss that today, along with Trump's anti-Latino rhetoric, chronic activation and ethnic blame discourse, segregation and why it continues yet remains mostly invisible, media literacy education, microaggressions, cancel culture, why there's no such thing as a positive stereotype, and, luckily, solutions to the problems that we're facing right now in regards to media misrepresentations and stereotypes. I've been using Dr. Dixon's research in my classes for years, and I studied him during my master's program nearly a decade ago, so I've been looking forward to chatting with him for some time about his work. So with that, I hope you enjoy Dr. Travis Dixon. It's been incredible to watch a genealogical perspective unfold in real time. So I now teach and I use a lot of genealogical theory. Like to understand the present, you have to look to the past or else we're going to miss what's coming next. And you managed to grab this field of research where you can almost do the same study every 10 years and find different results that reveal a whole lot about what's going on behind the scenes in our culture. Thinking about how to frame this interview, and that's sort of how I see all the things we talk about unfolding at the same time through this genealogical lens. I just dumped a lot on you before you introduced yourself. I want to thank you for coming to the show and start by saying, do you want to just introduce yourself briefly and tell us what got you into this line of work?
Sure. My name is Professor Travis Dixon. I am a professor of communication in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I'm also the Director of Graduate Studies there at this time. And I have been doing research in the area of media effects, specifically stereotyping and media effects, for a couple of decades now, a little bit more than that now. And, I came to the topic because of my experiences as a Black man growing up in America, to be honest with you. This is the most direct answer in terms of my interests. Sometimes I point to a story about my first experiences as an undergraduate student at UCLA. So in the old days, we had computers, but they were mainframes, and we didn't have them in our hands and our phones. And so back in those days, if you wanted to enroll in class, you filled out a little card. You actually filled out a little postcard. You sent the postcard in to the registrar, and then the registrar would enter in the classes on the mainframe. Now, if let's say the class enrollment cap was 100, if you were the 101st person, you got put on the wait list and you didn't get your classes. So UCLA had this programs, and lots of universities still have these kinds of programs where they encourage you to do an early orientation over the summer so that you would get priority enrollment, which meant that you'd be one of the early people and you'd be much more likely to get your classes. So I show up, and you actually stay in the dorms for a couple of days. It gets you used to what dorm life is going to be and having a roommate and all of that. And what I recall is, as soon as I kind of got to campus, I encountered what we now call, we have these technical terms for them. Today, we call these things microaggressions, a lot of basically small slights and racist behaviors from a number of different people. My roommate gave me this really strange look when he saw me, like, oh my God, there's a Black man in my room. What am I going to do? Freshman at that time, UCLA is a very competitive school. It's one of the most difficult schools to enroll in the entire world. It's a really good school by the beach with good weather. So that makes it very popular. When I was there, right, the freshmen were very proud of themselves. And so they would brag about their accomplishments and why they got into UCLA. They brag on their test scores and AP credits and other things along those lines. And so I see everybody else doing that. I said, okay, let me brag on this stuff I did. And there were these really strange looks like, you did stuff? And then every other person asked me if I was an athlete, which struck me really strangely because I was a geek nerd in high school. Yeah, I was a lot of things. I was not an athlete. I had a lot of friends who played ball, though, and I respect them greatly. And a lot of them went to college and are still my friends to this day. But, there was always a clear distinction between who the athletes were. They looked a certain way and they talked about certain things that, geeks and nerds didn't normally do. So all of that said, it was really, all of those were microaggressions. And I'll tell you about one more part, because I mentioned the enrollment thing. One of the culminating thing, right, is that you get to enroll in your classes. Now you work with a counselor to do this. And I brought my list of classes to the counselor. And the counselors up until that point had been friendly and approachable and really cool. And I sent my list, and it was a really standard list of classes. It was English 3, linguistics 1, and it was either econ or psych, but it was basically like a parametrics. Actually, it was math. It's like a math class that was doing non-parametric kinds of math. So I still remember my freshman class. I can't remember any of the other ones. There's a reason why I remember, because my counselor was just like, you can't enroll in English 3. And I just thought, well, absolutely, I should be able to enroll in English 3 because that's freshman English and I'm going to be a freshman. And I passed the requisite test to enroll in English 3. And he was just like, you did not pass the subject A test. I'm like, well, absolutely. That was called the subject A test at that time. So yeah, I did. You have to pass the subject A test, or you have to get a certain grade in your AP score in order to enroll in English 3. And I just thought, yeah, I did that. Like, it's like he's talking to me like I didn't know what test I had to do, like that I had done it, right? I mean, it's okay to check and say, hey, if he had just asked once, oh, did you pass subject A? Because in order to enroll in English 3, you had to have passed it. That's not a horrible question to ask a freshman of any kind, be honest with you, because freshmen make mistakes, right? That's what you're there to check. But the insistence that I could not have passed subject A, so being the geek nerd that I was, and the fact that it was not the 21st century yet, meant that I had a printout of the actual test results in my dorm room, which I went up to the dorm room, grabbed the test results, brought them back down, and he was a little bit pissed that I was right. It's like, oh, shoot, he's actually correct. Yes, I'm correct. So what hit me at that time, there are two things that I decided, there are kind of two things that happened to me in that freshman moment that changed the trajectory, to answer your question. One is it was a great presentation about communication, the discipline, and the major at UCLA that I thought, yes, this is really, really cool. It explains quite a bit about the world and how it works. But then I began this working hypothesis, which was none of these people that I was interacting with, in spite of the fact that LA is a very diverse city, it's still segregated like a lot of other places, although now it's gentrified, which is more complicated. But historically, it was at that time very segregated. In spite of the fact that like we're this diverse city, people's experience is a mediated experience. In other words, they only know about Black people from TV and media. Yeah, they know like, oh, there are athletes obviously that play for UCLA that are pretty famous, and there are famous other athletes in LA, particularly basketball players and others. So they get that, right? That Black people can do well at sports and can do well enough in sports that they will be at UCLA. So that makes sense. The other thing is that obviously like Black people are not supposed to be smart. We're not supposed to be intelligent. We're not supposed to do well at various kinds of tasks that are intellectual tasks. And so, you know, like how could you have passed? What do you mean you got a 4 on your AP history test? That's like not possible. You're Black. You know, that kind of thing. Like those reactions are from the fact that they've seen a multitude of messages that say Black people are not very smart, they're athletes. If they are here, it's like affirmative action, meaning that they're too stupid to really be here, but we're being nice to them. Not affirmative action in the sense of opportunity for those who are neglected, but those who are not really worthy. And so that was all, those explain all the interactions. And these are all mediated things. It hit me that because there's no actual contact with people of color, with people like me, like they have actually not met. You know, I came from what people call South Central Los Angeles or South LA. But one of the things that people don't know about South LA, just sometimes it's not communicated really well. It's actually only been communicated effectively, in my view, in like one major film that people have seen. There is a lot of diversity in that community. So there's a lot of different kinds of Black people, you know? Yeah. And so I know that growing up, there are some that are nerdy, geeky, go to church. There's some that are doing things that fulfill the stereotype of being, you know, gangster or whatever, or drug dealer. You know, my block, I had all kinds of people who lived there. Teacher on one side, I had a police officer on another side, and down the street, there was a drug dealer. Yeah. Like literally, that was my block.
And that's actually, I mean, you're describing any block in the United States. It depends which blocks are visible are the ones that the infrastructure allows visibility. But there's those same people on my block, no matter where I live.
Exactly, right? There's all this diversity, but the media says there's only one kind of person who lives there, and this is all that they know. And that's not really true. There is a diversity of experience. I realized that it was a media thing, and I began to try to test whether or not the media did distort things. I'm a social scientist. So as a social scientist, I have to not just say like, oh, I think this is happening. I have to have evidence and try to, in a systematic way, determine what the patterns are and what the effect of the patterns are. And that's what I've spent the last couple of decades trying to do, is look at both of those things.
It's worth unpacking before we move on positive stereotypes, because in that story was something that I get asked in almost all of my classes that I teach about race. How can positive stereotypes be something that we should avoid? Hey, I just said he was an athlete. How can you get mad at me? How that becomes an excuse for us to deploy language that reinforces these same old systems of white supremacy. So can you say a little more about that?
Sure. So this is a really great point. In fact, in the models that I've tried to develop and in the discussions that I've tried to have with my students over the years, I don't spend a lot of time talking about negative or positive stereotypes, because part of this is that defining those in a way that we can socially agree upon is interesting, right? That's the first part about like that, right? Is a geek and a nerd really positive? You know?
Well, I'd like to think so, right? And I'm sure you would too, but
I would like to think so. You know what I'm trying to say? Like under certain social circumstances in the academy, it is. Yeah. You know, if you're intellectual, it is.
What you're saying is it was a contextual way to out you or to make you other. In other words, it may have been
othering. So the othering is the thing. It's the othering process, as we would say, definitely in critical language. And what I would say is it is from a social scientist standpoint, it is the lack of diversity. So that's what we need to really focus on, where we think of any group, Asian, Americans, Latinos, African Americans, Native Americans, any group that you want to think of, they are only one way. So this group only has these certain characteristics. And sometimes those characteristics are what some people would say are positive and some people say negative. But the idea is that you're taking that entire group and saying, we can only think of them along the lines of 2 or 3 characteristics. And so it's trying to think about whether or not they're restricted to those or whether or not we consider the diversity of experiences. That matters. And I'm super thankful for my overall experience at UCLA. Like, it was amazing in a lot of ways. It was very racist. It was, UCLA is like the kind of place that is, like, it has interesting history because there's a lot of progressive people there. It's in LA. And so, you think of it in some ways as a very democratic place, but there are lots of different ways in which there are very significant racial power structures that influence all kinds of decisions about everything, student, faculty, and other things. I actually returned as a faculty member and saw it again from a different vantage point of when I was an undergrad. So I have to say, like, those structures are there, but my experience of really interacting with lots of other people, okay, even I had that, right? Like, I grew up in a neighborhood that was, at the time, when I was younger, it was probably about 70-80% Black. By the time I was older, it was more like 40-50% Black because it was more Latino. So I interacted with a number of Latinos, a number of African Americans, but I had not interacted as extensively with other racial groups and people with other religious preferences. And so that experience of having that and being able to do that really helped me not to be narrow in my view, right? Like, it is a good thing. Contact is a wonderful thing if it's done in the right way. It can actually help you think about, again, all these groups in terms of all the diversity, right? Like, there are buttholes in every racial group. There's buttholes in every kinds of class or different religions. So understanding that is more important than negative and positive.
I teach a class called Prison and Communication and Social Justice. So it's centered around the same thing you're talking about, but specifically about prisoners. How do we all know so much about prisons when most of us haven't been there? And I ask them on the first week of class, how many of you went to segregated schools? And I, like clockwork, get 1 out of 30 that's like, I think the right answer is yes, but doesn't know why. And then I'll ask them again 2 or 3 weeks before the end of the class. And like clockwork, 75% of them are like, oh, because of what you just explained. Hegemonic systems work so much better when you can actually keep the other away, because the second you start to interact with somebody and realize they're just like you, or it's a human environment we live in, that these separations are entirely man-made, but they sustain all these other oppressive systems that don't really work unless we're all busy bickering against whoever we've been told is our other.
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Trying to get to the idea that we share different values and strengths and characteristics as human beings. We obviously have cultural differences that exist because of history and traditions and other things. And we should always be cool to acknowledge that and to celebrate them all. That's not our problem. But we should also not act like we're limited by that. That's just one little piece of our experience and what makes us who we are.
And if anybody's ever wondered, had a relative or wondered themselves, so what about segregation and why it was such a big argument? I mean, it never really went away, but it popped up and came to a head in the 60s and 70s. This is why, is that it automatically allows systems of stereotypes to take root and go deeper. So Eileen, speaking of roots, this is what your studies, that I'm interested in all of them, but that I've followed this genealogical approach from teaching you to love fear, although I believe you did one earlier than that. But teaching you to love fear is based on a content analysis of television, because we've all known for years that something doesn't feel right, but seldom have you had exactly what you explained, the statistical ammo to pull out and say, it's right here. I can show you where the discrepancies are. So can you talk a little bit about teaching you to love fear, which is 10 years old now, I think, 2011?
Yeah. Teaching us to love fear is really a summary. It's like the first one of maybe 2 or 3 I ended up doing. And it focuses on a couple of things that I guess we should get to. One, it focuses on idea of crime and who is a criminal. And it focuses a lot on the Los Angeles area, which is where I'm from. And if we were to look at a local television news in Los Angeles at that time, this is the early part of the 21st century. If you were to look at the news at that time, one of the things that you would notice is that there was a very clear pattern in terms of representation of African Americans as being criminals, right? And so what we did a number of different things. We did what we call intergroup comparisons, interrole, interreality. The intergroup comparisons, we just take different racial groups and we say, how often do they appear in a particular role on television? So in other words, if you have a Black person and a white person, who's more likely to appear as a criminal in the news, right? And if you were to look at that, for every white criminal you see in television news, you see about 2 Black people, right? Then you can ask the second question, which is, well, what happens in terms of the kinds of roles that a racial group might occupy in the television news? Again, back to the idea of positive and negative, which is socially constructed, okay? So if we socially construct it from a very conservative view, the negative imagery would be the criminal and the positive imagery would be being an officer. But some people would quibble with that construction, okay? Just to let you know. I never forget when I was younger, I love watching these reruns on cable occasionally. There's a movie called Heat with Robert De Niro.
That's not old. Cut it out, man.
Well, it's been some years since he came out, man. It's not recent anymore.
You're right. I might have still been sneaking to watch that bit.
Right? Because you can tell when those old movies come on now because it's not as crisp. And so anyway, I was watching, like, do you remember when they do that first, the bank heist? Yep. And they're shooting all the cops, right? With automatic weapons. Yep. It's really loud. It goes crazy. Well, when it's not the beginning, but you know, where they have the heist and there's somebody think them and therefore the police show up. I saw that in the theater. And when that happened, people cheered the police getting shot. I mean, they thought that was the greatest thing in the world. Like, yeah, they're jacking them. You know, it was really interesting, right? So I'm saying that whole positive negative thing, like what is positive negative role? What is a positive negative image or stereotype even is interesting because people have problems with the police and the way they operate. That said, if you do the interrole, you find that Black people are 2 times more likely to show up as a perpetrator than as an officer. And if it's a felony, it's even worse. Like they're 3 times more likely to show up as a felon than as an officer. The opposite is true of whites. Whites are like twice as likely to appear as an officer than as a criminal suspect. So what is that communicating to us? There's a picture that's forming here, right? But then we do the interreality comparison. And here what we try to do is we just look at the statistics in terms of reports, just how often are different racial groups arrested for crime. Looking at African Americans,
right?
White.
Maybe all white. Maybe all cops are white. I don't know.
Right? Maybe the cops really are white, and maybe more Black people commit crime. There's historical and sociological reasons why crime gets committed at certain rates, and so maybe that's what's going on. So we do the interreality comparison, and what we find there is that Blacks are indeed overrepresented as criminal suspects in comparison to crime reports. They are probably, depending upon the measure we're using, 30 to 40% of the criminal suspects, depending if we're talking about felons or what have you, in television news, but they're less than that. They're significantly less than that when we look at actual crime reports. You know, this is part of what's going on in terms of the early work, you know, like there's a very, very consistent pattern. If we're talking about criminality, Black people are strongly associated with that across all 3 measures. If we're talking about who's an officer, white officers are overrepresented in comparison to their employment records. So we're much more likely in the news to see a white officer represented than them to even be employed as officers, according to employment records for LA. That pattern is telling people white people are responsible for protecting us. They are the officers and we should like them. It's a very favorable kind of view of
that. And power. I mean, it's worth interjecting here, whether we agree or not that police officers are superheroes or whether you have a personal bias against them. What we can agree on is that we all come out of pocket every day because we want to be able to call 911 when a creeper's trying to break in the back of the house at 2 a.m. And that comes with a lot of power, a gun, the ability to arrest somebody. That often goes completely awry, as we've seen. So we could just position it as power and say, if you're positioning white people consistently in positions of power at disproportionate rates, and you're positioning Black folks and people of color, because as we'll see, this actually gets quite a bit more interesting than this was the 2011 version that I would guess probably held from the late 90s.
Yes. Think about what's going on at that time, what's happening during that era. Interesting now to look at the current political debate around criminal justice reform and the positioning of Hillary Clinton, Bernie Sanders, and Joe Biden around things like the crime bill. The reason why there was a crime bill and one of the reasons why there are several just political and other sociological, like obviously I know you talk about this stuff all the time, but one of the reasons for that was because of the crack epidemic. But you know, that created this notion that you had to have greater police presence, force, it was a move towards criminalizing behaviors. That we could probably spend like an hour talking about. Obviously, it was criminalized when the people were using were Black, but now we think of this as more drug use or addiction when it's not Black people anymore.
Yep. The opioid crisis is in fact a white opioid crisis, as I've talked about in the last couple of weeks. Now it's for white communities, and we're like, oh, sound the alarm.
Yeah, sound the alarm, but also with compassion. Let's have the the pens, right? There was controversy over whether or not you had like Metrodome and other thing for heroin, or the other one.
Narcan. Yeah, you're talking about Narcan to reverse overdoses.
There we go. Right, there was all that controversy, and now it's funny how it's not as controversial. It's like, officers should have that, and we should be.
And then methadone on the flip side, but I think we're going to have heroin clinics in Denver, fingers crossed, within a couple of years here.
Yeah. So that is the other part of this, right? Which is, it goes back again to those implicit stereotypes, which is Black people are not as human and not as worthy of human compassion and treatment. And therefore they should be seen as a threat, as just inherently bad, inherently criminal. And the news media really kind of carried that forward, both through the actual representation of Black people as criminals, but also this opposite, which you're pointing out. White people are part of the power structure, are in charge of cleaning this mess up.
The one piece to add to that, I always hope that there's some listeners that have just decided to tune in that are kind of like, I don't know if that really makes a difference, even if they are overrepresented. Imagine what happens in your brain and body when you see somebody victimized, even if it's the Shawshank Redemption and Andy Dufresne is being victimized. Unless you have something going on, you experience it, you feel it. And when you feel somebody being victimized, you naturally feel empathy for that person. And adding it up over and over eventually builds up to where when you think of a criminal right now, this is the end result, the fruit. And I love that if you think about this the right way, your work gives people a safe doorway that have been very resistant to saying, maybe the country does have some stuff that it still needs to work on, but they feel personally implicated. The second you find a way into that argument that doesn't make you responsible for constructing white supremacy from scratch, you can realize, oh, this was something that was designed to stay invisible and to exist forever. And it's not your fault until you start to realize it and say, I don't really want to recognize that. We've all been watching TV. Once you tune into this culture for so long, you soak up the soup.
I agree. And I agree that it's the socialization agent, particularly the media is a big one. It's a huge one. And it begins to tell us how to think. So that gets into this. Let me talk about effects then, because I think you're now hitting at effects. It's not just that we stopped with the content stuff, although it's great to talk about it. And in subsequent years, we did a number of different experiments as well. And we found a couple of things, right? So if you are watching television news regularly, particularly television news that tends to highlight this Black criminality, and some of the experiments we actually would measure how much television news you watch prior, and then we expose people to different kinds of conditions where they saw crime stories with a number of Black suspects or a number of white suspects. And then we gave them hypotheticals afterwards. And it turns out that people who watch a lot of television news, and if they saw, several stories with Black suspects, they tended to be more empathetic to things like the death penalty. For our hypothetical, they tend to think that that person is unredeemable, that they're culpable, that these things kind of interact with your prior news viewing. And when you get into this new situation and you're judging it, you're like, oh, yeah. There's some social scientific notions here that we use to talk about this called accessibility, chronic accessibility, and chronic activation are some of the key psychological terms and communication terms that we use to explain this process. But basically, think of it as this association or link between African Americans and criminality is triggered every time you watch it. And so because that link is triggered repeatedly, once you're in this new situation, you're more likely to use that cognitive link to make judgments. And that's the reason why that happens, right? So this is not just, hypothetical or maybe it happens. No, we know it does happen. We did some surveys as well. And in the surveys, we specifically, because we had the content analysis, we knew kind of who the worst actors were in terms of television stations, and they're not all created equal. And so we know that if you were watching particular local affiliates in Los Angeles, you would get a particularly high dose of this misrepresentation of Blacks as criminal suspects. So we measured that. And then we had people, again, do the hypotheticals of like, here's a young person who's accused of committing a crime. Do you think that they have a chance of being redeemed, or do you think we should lock them away, throw away the key? What do you think we should do? And the other thing we did is we embedded experiment to survey. We like doing things like that. Yeah. So we actually had one case, we said he was a white guy, right? And then another case, we said he's a black guy. And another case, we didn't say a race. Now, here's the deal. If you watch lots of this kind of problematic news and you saw the white suspect, you said, give him another chance. You know, this kid might be redeemable. But if you watch lots of that kind of news and you saw the black child, you said, lock him up, throw away the key, not redeemable. He's going to be a menace to society his entire life. You did a similar thing, though, when he was unidentified. And that's evidence of what we call chronic accessibility. That link between criminality and blackness is so strong that even if I just say a criminal, prison, some of the things you're saying, blackness just immediately comes to mind. Why? Because that's what we've had associated over and over and over again by the media, and it makes it chronically accessible. That is what we know happens psychologically after exposure to this kind of stuff.
Hence the name of the article, or the chapter, which was teaching you to love fear. So we're about to jump on this genealogical train, but before we go there, I always like to take opportunities for all the people that think we're conspiracy theorists to ask the question that's almost rhetorical, but we should still say it out loud anyway. Why do you think news organizations are doing this? Is there this meeting of rich, racist white men in the back room that are like, how can we perpetuate white supremacy and make sure it never goes away? Which I can't imagine how that directly makes them money. Or do you think there's something else?
So that's a great question. It's the one that I get asked a lot. I have 3 explanations for you. I think these explanations, I'll hand on 2 of them today because I think 2 of them are really super important. But we've talked about 3 over the years, so I just want to be honest about the 3. The first one is one that was originally advanced by, I don't know if Van Dyke was an actual linguist, or he did a particular technique where he would go out and he would interview people. And there's a certain kind of discourse analysis is what it's called. You do discourse analysis after he did these interviews. And he did them overseas. He would ask people about different things like, how do you feel about society and how everything's going? And what he found was invariably, without really being prompted, these primarily white, either Danish or British people would say things like, everything's fine except the immigrants are ruining it all. Everything's good except we have this problem with the immigrants and they're the ones who are causing it. And he came up with this term called ethnic blame discourse. Ethnic blame discourse is the idea that when we try to understand social policies or issues, we invoke and think about ethnic others, okay? That was later translated by another professor over here, and he began to push this idea as well. His name is Dan Romer. He began to push this idea as well of ethnic blame in terms of how these things get explained. I didn't get into the victim stuff, but the victim stuff is just as bad as the perpetrator stuff. And you can imagine who is typically portrayed as a victim and who's not. Yep. So I'll just leave it at that and tell you that Romer focused in on victims in his study as well, and found that blame discourse kind of begins to pervade newsrooms and thinking about how to talk about issues, right? Yeah. So the way, later work I do deal with this too. So the way to talk about immigration is, it's primarily a problem of Latinos, even though there are lots of other immigrants, some documented, some undocumented, from all kinds of different countries. And I would occasionally read these really interesting stories about them under the Trump administration because they all fared badly under the Trump administration. And that said, that's how the reporters they have beats and other things. And it's like, oh yeah, to understand. And there's another scholar who talks about this as everyday racism and his way of discussing it. His name is Hyder. Hyder has an idea that's very related to this, which talks about the journalistic practices. So here's the thing. You're talking a lot about how people being aware and thinking about systems and then trying to interrogate themselves. And that's a process. Talk about socializing agents. So if you've been socialized from birth a certain way, and then you're continuously being socialized, it's work to undo it. And so ethnic blame discourse also suggests that at an unconscious level, that blame discourse emanates from that socialization. So the reporters, who are largely white, who are largely not a diverse group of people at all, and who have not really interrogated things strongly, are not generally encouraged, because most people don't do that. Most of us just follow it. This is part of how that discourse gets in there and how they tend to think of it in these racialized terms. And they're also appealing to an audience that they think, well, how's my audience going to react? I need to speak in those terms as well to them to keep my ratings up, which gets me to the second explanation. So the first one's, I think, blame discourse. This discourse involves the way that reporters think about the issues, the way they report out the issues with the assumptions of what their audience is going to be like, that certain issues are racialized. Second thing is structural limitations and economic interests of the media. So the media operate primarily to make money. I know this is not a surprise to you, or maybe to many of your audience members, but I know that we have narratives around the media, like the news media's First Amendment, they're here to inform us and make us a better democracy and all of that stuff. And there is some truth to that, but their primary goal is to totally make money. So profit exists. If you think about economics, basic economics, I want to have high revenues. I want to have low cost. Okay. How can I get high revenues and low cost? If I'm going to tell a story about murder, or if I want to tell a story that's going to get people interested, murder is a good one because we have murder mysteries. We have whole like horror and other kinds of genres where people
love
just
it.
watch. I tried to turn this morning, actually, I tried to turn on the local news. I can barely watch the local news. But I turned it on, I was like, okay, let me see. I wanted to see the weather. And I really don't like, I have 12-year-old sons, and I don't like them seeing that stuff all the time. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to watch it. And I watched the weather, and I was like, okay, I started to turn off. I was like, let me just go ahead and see.
Have they fixed it yet?
And then within 1 minute, here's a murder. It's like, right? So why? Well, murders, particularly at this interpersonal violence level, generates interest. It's really easy to explain. Can be heart-wrenching. It pulls on emotions. You empathize with victims, and you start thinking in your mind, what would I do if this happened? Or what under these circumstances? The viewer really gets drawn in, and that's how they have high revenues. In a lot of the major cities, they have helicopters that do reporting, that do these high-speed chases. There's no news information in a high-speed chase. It really isn't. But they get people watch, like, oh my God, when is the guy gonna jump out and realize he's caught? Like, when is he gonna run out of fuel? Or how are they gonna catch him? Or are they gonna shoot him or beat him, because they're pissed? So there are all these things that we're watching, but it has no real news value. Why? Because the revenues are high and it's easy to do. Now, here's the thing. Now watch this. Those are all blue-collar crimes. I'm talking about the blue-collar crime interests. Yeah. These blue-collar crimes tend to be committed by people who are poor. So people who are poor are disproportionately people of color. That's one of the reasons why we get so many people of color as criminal suspects and in the news specifically. Well, how about this, right? Equally problematic are murder stories. But let me tell you a different murder story. How about a murder story that involves a multinational company that knows that it's sending out products that kill adults and kids, but they still do it, and thousands of people die as a result of that? That's still a murder story, right? But one of them, they might be buying commercial time. Also, it's complicated. If it's an interpersonal story, one person pulled the trigger, and I know who I'm saying the perpetrator is, and I know who I'm saying the victim is in this case, right? Because one person's going to be dead, and that person's definitely the victim. Another person is alleged to have pulled the trigger, and that's the alleged perpetrator. But what happens when it's a multinational? Is it just the CEO? Is it the marketing person? Who is that? Is it the whole company? And how do we think about blame in that situation? How do we get the evidence that they knew, which involves investigative reporting and time and money and energy by the news? Plus, these might be our person buying the ad. So guess what? I'm not going to talk about those deaths. I'm just really not going to talk about it as much.
This is how capitalism is built. I know you're on a time frame, so I want to get to this second study, but it's worth pointing out, libel too, that not just in the case we're talking about, that you're much likely to get sued by a poor person than a company or Donald Trump, who has a bunch of lawyers whose job it is to just file suits against anyone that talks shit, but also with police officers who are making arrests. If you wonder why there's more arrests in low-income communities, it doesn't take a genius to realize, oh man, I just got my pantsuit off and got rode up because I arrested the wrong guy. But I've noticed in some areas, I don't ever get challenged and I can get away with more stuff.
Yes, that's exactly true.
So I want to talk about the second study because I think it reveals a lot. You did it a little bit different, but can you talk about the second one, which I think I read a summary called Good Guys Are Still Always in White.
All right, yes. So we went back to LA some years later, and we wanted to see how things had changed. And this gets me maybe to that third explanation too, which is cool. So here's what has changed in LA news reporting. And again, every time, I want to be clear about this. Content analyses are snapshots. They're just picture in time at one point of what's going on. And like I mentioned to you earlier, what was happening in the 90s was crime bill because of issues around drugs, importation, and other things was leading to public concern about that, both in Congress as well as in Black and brown communities, to be honest with you. It was like big concern. At that time, that was the emphasis. So we did some, obviously we did our studies. I think there has been more, how can I say this? A little bit more reflection, if you will. I've actually talked to some of the people in the news agencies who are producers and what have you. There's stuff that's happened. I think I have a colleague out at USC, and I had another colleague at UCLA spending a lot of time working with Hollywood execs on thinking through more of these issues in the last, I would say, 10 years. This has been more happening. Well, okay, so what happens as a result of that? So we go back and we take a look at what things look like now. And the thing that we found, we did the inter-reality comparisons again, and we found that the Black representation had generally improved, right? That Black people were not overrepresented as criminals or victims or officers. Like the representation was pretty even for them across the three different categories. So that was a huge change that we did not expect. However, the biggest thing that was still there from the last time is white overrepresentation, specifically as officers and even as victims, I believe, in that study. And so that is still a constant. And like I said, I only hinted at the early victimization stuff, but I'll say that our early study found whites overrepresented as victims in 2000. They're still overrepresented as victims in this new study. They're still overrepresented as officers in this study. Again, we saw that overrepresentation as well in 2000. So that's kind of stayed the same. And I think there was some Latino underrepresentation as victims, if I recall correctly, as well, and maybe as officers. So those are the two things that were kind of really interesting updates and changes, whereas I think there's a little bit more awareness. There is the Black Lives Matter movement. There's other things that have made the news agencies a little bit more sensitive, a little bit more aware of
You're very kind. And you're making personal connections. So when you say it's your friends, I imagine that.
They're not my friends.
Oh, well, people you know. If you've seen or heard of conversations, when it is one-on-one, I get it. But if wokeness wasn't selling right now, I think those people would be told to shut the hell up like they have been for years. And I notice we live in a country that the theme of almost all of our historical progress is it's always couched in the best way to give a few people a very little bit that looks like we solved something. We write a 13th Amendment that codifies slavery for eternity. And then it looks like when you read it on its face that slavery is abolished, when in reality it says right in there, now we just got to convict you of a crime first.
Right.
And I wonder if, I feel like as you were talking about the stats with Latinos, that it should have, I could do it post if I wanted to, but putting build the wall chants behind you, that this cultural lust for white supremacy in some form, and it has to vent. And when it cannot vent any longer at Black folks, because our woke kids coming back from college are wearing Black Lives Matter shirts and there's forcing conversations, that doesn't just go away. It finds a new vent. And if the acceptable thing from the highest office in the land has been to say, when Mexico sends its people, they're sending rapists, they're sending drugs, that trickles down and people realize, hey, I think we just found a safe outlet.
That's a great point. I actually have another study that I wrote about that speaks directly to this. In that study, we found that, in fact, the media, specifically when it talks about undocumented immigrants, again, in a reality comparison, overrepresents in comparison to the statistics, best stats we have on who's undocumented, overrepresents how often they are Latino. That's one thing. I hinted at that earlier in our conversation. The second thing is that when you talk about whether or not a suspect is an immigrant, Latinos are overrepresented as being these immigrant suspects, which is what Trump was talking about. And to be honest with you, when I first heard the escalator, I call it the escalator speech. I think some people in the media call it that too. When I first saw the escalator speech, I'll be honest with you, I was like, what the heck is he talking about?
He had some good communication people working with him because you're right, he was on the front lines of an evolving.
I did not think about it. But then when I did the study, I was like, well, obviously the media has been showing that particular trope and reinforcing that particular stereotype for a while. I add this too, although this has received less attention as it should at this point, especially given what we know about the stats. But the other thing that happened in that other study is talking about religion. If you were Muslim, much more likely to be associated with terrorism, overrepresented as terrorists and terrorist suspects in comparison to reality. Even at that time, when we did the study some years ago now that we did it, there was a great overrepresentation in the actual reports regarding the real terrorist threat, which is white supremacist terrorists. They've been a threat for a long time. Now, obviously, after the January 6th and QAnon and Proud Boys and other things that we're talking about today are receiving a little bit more media attention, but the reality is that the FBI has been concerned about them for quite some time and have documented that they pose the most lethal threat in the United States. So you're right about everything you're saying. I'm agreeing with you on this idea that things shifted, right? And so that third perspective is guard dog, when internal threats versus external threats can modify what the attention of the media is, there can be these different shifts. Yeah. So there was one particular thing seen as an internal threat, which was the crack epidemic. And now this external threat of Latinos and Muslims, and that then shifts the coverage. And then we're focusing on that. And that's one of the reasons why you saw that shift.
Yeah, and until we get rid of our cultural identity of spend 10 times as much money on guns and bombs and everything else because we're deeply rooted afraid, we cannot live without that fear. That also bleeds into, we live in luxury by and large in this country. Granted, it's a terrible system and that 1% controls 47 and we have poverty and homelessness across the country. But if we could just tweak what we actually have bounty for the first time really in human history, right? But we also have never let go of this cultural identity of, I wish you would, because we've been, dumping money into that. So in our last few minutes here, what are your thoughts on solutions?
The biggest solution for the consumer is using the platforms that we have today to do two things. One is to provide really good feedback to the news agencies about what you will and will not follow, what you will and will not tolerate or like. Because they are a market, right? Obviously, they're a market. So like I said, the structural limitations and economic interest is a big one. So, asking them, hey, do you have a diverse news staff? And are you interrogating these issues? Because the only way to deal with the ethnic blame and the unconscious bias is to make it conscious, is to really be effortful in how you think about issues. And then two, say, hey, if you're doing that, I'm going to retweet all your stuff. I'm going to make sure that my platform's used to enhance you so you can make more money. But if you're not doing that, I'm not going to do that for you.
Capitalism, right? To hammer it from the inside and say, hey,
you've got to, because they're only going to respond to, and here's the thing, they're all under pressure because of all these structural changes.
Yeah.
Like they're all under
culture.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. And but they're losing money. I mean, I'll think about all the newspapers that are going under, think about all the other things. Like structurally, the whole idea of journalism is being challenged now. Like, what is it? How does it operate? How do we fund it? That's a big question. So coming up with basically feedback, if you will, to them on how you want to push them is key to this. The second thing is, because we have social media, you have a podcast, people have blogs, other things, begin to tell those stories and amplify those stories and amplify as many diverse stories as we can to get the word out about what's going on and various viewpoints. I think we need to be thinking creatively and broadly about that, and making sure that I recently spoke to a group of what people call the Divine Nine. It's a group of fraternities and sororities in the African-American community that have a long history of social activism, because I'm a member of one of them. And what I said to them was, I said, look, what we should be doing is thinking about our platforms and amplifying our stories in new and effective ways for the 21st century, so that we're not being limited, if you will, by just a few set of narratives, right? Like, 'cause we have to tell our own stories, but then we also want to encourage them when they get it right. That was good. Yeah. See, a lot of times it's easy for people to say, I didn't like that. Start telling them when it's good too. Start telling them when that was a great story. I'm going to retweet it. I'm going to also tag you in a tweet and let you know I've told everybody why it's good, and encouraging everyone to think about what's raised by your news story or your film or what have you.
Or your rap, as some of your future research. I mean, there's already statistics. So as a final thing to think about for my listeners, if you want to read some thoughts on how rap music is already seeing this change because of social media, forcing a space where conglomerate organizations can no longer just package sexual misogyny and all the other bullshit in rap. It's already working. This might sound like, yeah, right, we just need to retweet stuff. The fact is, you've already done these studies.
No, exactly right. Yeah, just keep pushing that out, because what you'll find is they will react because they want to make money, and they want to ultimately, unfortunately, we live in this capitalist society, right? That's going to be the main driving thing, quite a bit more than we expect. So I just I would say those two things are the most important things.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sitting down with me. Any final thoughts you want to add before we get out of here?
No, I want to thank you for the time. I want to reiterate your call for everybody to continuously see this as work. So people oftentimes think it's just like, snap my fingers, I'm good, and I don't have to worry about anything. I'm still learning things. I'm still growing. I still have a ways to go when it comes to all the isms. And I am trying to continuously make myself better, educate myself more, and dedicate myself to it. I just want everybody to remember it's a continuous thing. It's not it's just done. No, it's like, it's a lifetime commitment.
Yeah, me too. Exactly the same. And I'm 10 years into studying this too. So if we aren't anywhere near figuring it out, and we're not also personally attacked by somebody pointing out a problematic, a racist comment I inadvertently make, or somehow I reinforce the domination of women, we need to become more comfortable pointing those out.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
Cool. I think that's a great way to end it.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, that was Dr. Travis Dixon, and you can find his work online. You heard us talk about a lot of his research, but the central article we discussed was from a book called Challenging the Prison Industrial Complex. And his chapter was called Teaching You to Love Fear, Television News and Racial Stereotypes in a Punishing Democracy. The war on drugs continues to thrive because of our misunderstandings about drugs and those who use them. And those misunderstandings are sustained by the media we consume. Dr. Dixon's work gives us a great way to understand how that happens and how to avoid it. So amplify the stories, songs, and books that you find most empowering, and challenge the oppressive systems. Speak out against those which perpetuate that same old racist, sexist, etc.ist bullshit. Use your social media. Dr. Dixon's work has already revealed a connection between social media promoting positive rap and a change in messages which record labels are now willing to produce or to amplify. It works, but we have to do it. Love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm your host, Ben Boyce.